The winter solstice festival of 257 BCE found Alexander, now 89 years old, standing atop the great ziggurat of Babylon. As sacrificial fires blazed beneath a canopy of stars, the aging conqueror gazed across the city he had reclaimed from decay. Babylon, once intended as his capital before illness nearly claimed him, had been transformed into a wonder that surpassed even its ancient glory. Yet as attendants steadied his arm against the chill wind, Alexander's thoughts were not on past triumphs but on gathering storms. Word had reached him days earlier, a massive uprising had erupted in Egypt, led by a charismatic priest claiming descent from the pharaohs. Simultaneously, his spies reported that his grandson Ptolemy, installed as governor of Macedonia, was secretly negotiating with Celtic tribes beyond the northern frontier. Most disturbing of all, Alexander IV, his eldest son and presumed heir, had begun consulting astrologers about the date of his father's death. The empire Alexander had spent a lifetime building now faced its greatest test. Not from external enemies he could meet on the battlefield, but from within, from the contradictions and tensions inherent in its vast, multicultural expanse. The final decade of Alexander's extraordinary life would be defined not by new conquests, but by a desperate struggle to preserve his legacy against forces that threatened to tear it apart. The Egyptian revolt of 256 BCE represented the first major internal challenge to imperial authority in decades. Unlike earlier rebellions motivated primarily by tax burdens or local grievances, this uprising had a distinctly ideological character. Its leader, Nectanebo III, claimed to be restoring Egypt's ancient independence and religious purity against foreign corruption. Temples became centers of resistance, with priests denouncing the syncretistic religious policies that had been a cornerstone of Alexander's rule. What made this revolt particularly dangerous was its sophisticated understanding of imperial vulnerabilities. Rebels targeted grain shipments bound for other provinces, disrupted communication routes, and spread propaganda specifically designed to appeal to non-Greek populations throughout the empire. Archaeological evidence suggests coordinated actions in Syria, Judea, and parts of Anatolia, indicating a network of anti-imperial sentiment that had developed largely undetected by Alexander's intelligence services. The aging Alexander responded with characteristic decisiveness but surprising subtlety. Rather than immediately dispatching armies to crush the rebellion, the approach of his younger years, he first deployed cultural and religious countermeasures. Teams of priests from the imperial cult, accompanied by Egyptian clergy loyal to the throne, traveled throughout Egypt performing elaborate ceremonies that emphasized Alexander's divine status as son of Ammonius and legitimate pharaoh. Simultaneously, imperial agents identified and addressed specific local grievances that had fueled popular support for the rebellion. Tax relief was granted to regions suffering from Nile flooding, grain reserves were distributed in areas experiencing shortages, and corrupt local officials were publicly punished. These measures created divisions within the rebel movement, separating ideological leaders from those who had joined due to economic hardship. Only after these political maneuvers had weakened rebel cohesion did Alexander authorize military action. Even then, he avoided mass reprisals that might create martyrs. Instead, special forces, the elite hypaspists who had been with him since his earliest campaigns, conducted targeted operations to capture rebel leadership. Nectanebo himself was taken alive in a daring night raid on his headquarters in Memphis. What followed revealed the complexity of Alexander's approach to governance in his later years. Rather than executing the rebel leader, he arranged a public ceremony of reconciliation. Nectanebo publicly recognized Alexander's divine status and legitimate authority, while Alexander incorporated elements of Nectanebo's religious reforms into imperial policy, purifying certain Egyptian rites that had become overly Hellenized. The former rebel was then appointed to an advisory position on religious affairs, defanged as a threat but valuable as a voice for authentic Egyptian traditions. This episode established a pattern that would characterize Alexander's final years, meeting challenges not through brute force alone, but through a sophisticated combination of cultural accommodation, targeted concessions, and selective force, all while maintaining the fundamental integrity of imperial authority. the Egyptian crisis had barely been resolved when a more personal conflict erupted. Alexander IV, now 33 years old, had spent his life in his father's shadow. Raised to rule, he had distinguished himself in military campaigns along the northern frontier and served effectively as governor of Bactria. But as Alexander the Great entered his ninth decade with no signs of relinquishing power, the son's frustration grew increasingly evident. Court chronicles from this period describe heated arguments between father and son over imperial policy, particularly regarding the increasing influence of Persian and now Chinese ideas in governance. The younger Alexander advocated for a return to more traditionally Macedonian approaches, including greater privileges for Macedonian and Greek elites who felt increasingly marginalized by Alexander's multicultural policies. Matters came to a head in the summer of 255 BCE when Alexander IV abruptly left his posting in Bactria and traveled to Macedonia, where his cousin Ptolemy served as governor. Though official communications described this as a routine inspection tour, private correspondence uncovered by later historians reveals a more troubling purpose. The two men, both descendants of Alexander, began exploring the possibility of establishing a separate, Hellenic-centered state in Europe, effectively splitting the empire along cultural lines. Word of these discussions eventually reached Alexander through his extensive intelligence network. His response demonstrated both political acumen and fatherly anguish. Instead of publicly accusing his son of treason or dispatching forces to arrest him, Alexander announced his intention to travel to Macedonia himself, his first return to his homeland in decades, for what he described as a family reunion and consultation on the future governance of our European territories. The journey, undertaken despite his advanced age, became a carefully orchestrated demonstration of imperial majesty. In each city along the route, Alexander performed sacrifices, dispensed justice, and held public audiences where citizens could present petitions directly to the king. These performances served a dual purpose, reminding populations of the benefits of imperial rule while demonstrating that, despite his years, Alexander remained firmly in command. The confrontation between father and son occurred at Pella, the ancient Macedonian capital, in the spring of 254 BCE. No contemporaneous account of their private conversations survives, but the results became clear in subsequent months. Alexander IV returned to the east, not to his previous position in Bactria but to a newly created role coordinating trade and diplomatic relations with China, a position of genuine importance but far from the centers of imperial power. Ptolemy was removed as governor of Macedonia, replaced by Nearchus, Alexander's longtime admiral and one of his few surviving companions from the original conquests. Most significantly, Alexander announced a major revision to the succession plan, introducing the concept of regional co-rulers who would govern major portions of the empire under his overall authority during his lifetime and continue as a ruling council after his death. This restructuring, formalized in the Pella Declaration of 253 BCE, represented a fundamental shift in how the empire would be governed. Rather than attempting to maintain centralized control through a single successor, Alexander now envisioned a federated structure with significant autonomy for major regions. United by common economic interests, defensive arrangements, and the overarching ideology of the imperial cult, this political innovation drew inspiration from multiple sources: the Persian satrap system, Greek federal leagues, and Chinese administrative divisions, but combined them in a novel fashion suited to the unprecedented scale of Alexander's domains. By institutionalizing regional autonomy within an imperial framework, Alexander hoped to address separatist pressures while maintaining essential unity. Even as these internal tensions were being navigated, a new external threat emerged along the empire's northern frontier. Beginning around 252 BCE, a confederation of nomadic peoples known in Chinese sources as the Xiongnu and in Greek accounts as the Royal Scythians began consolidating power across the Eurasian steppes. Unlike previous nomadic groups that had been played against each other by both Alexander and China, this new confederation demonstrated sophisticated political organization and military coordination. Initial raids against imperial outposts along the northern frontier were dismissed as typical nomadic activity. But as attacks increased in frequency and scale, imperial intelligence began to piece together a more alarming picture. The Xiongnu leader, known in Greek sources as Modon, likely corresponding to the historical Modu Xiongnu, was systematically uniting the previously fragmented steppe peoples into a formidable military force, equipped with composite bows, armored cavalry, and siege techniques acquired through contact with both Chinese and Hellenistic settlements. By 250 BCE, the threat had become undeniable. A major Xiongnu force breached imperial defenses near modern Kazakhstan, penetrating hundreds of miles into Bactria and threatening the vital trade routes connecting the Mediterranean with China. Simultaneously, allied tribes launched raids into Thrace and along the Danube frontier, suggesting a level of strategic coordination previously unseen among steppe peoples. This crisis demanded a military response on a scale Alexander had not undertaken in years. Despite his advanced age, now 92, Alexander insisted on personally overseeing the strategic response, though physical command on the battlefield was delegated to younger generals. Drawing on decades of experience, he implemented a three-pronged strategy. First, rapid response forces were dispatched to key choke points along the frontier. Not to defeat the nomadic forces outright, an impossibility given their mobility and dispersed nature, but to channel their movements toward prepared defensive positions. Second, diplomatic missions were sent to Chinese authorities, proposing coordinated action against what was now recognized as a common threat. Third, economic warfare was implemented, with Alexander ordering the suspension of trade with any tribes allied with the Xiongnu, while offering generous terms to those willing to break from the confederation. The military response culminated in the Battle of the Jaxartes in the summer of 249 BCE, where imperial forces under the command of Alexander's grandson Perseus confronted the main Xiongnu army. The battle demonstrated how warfare had evolved during Alexander's long reign. Perseus employed a combined arms approach that integrated elements from multiple military traditions, a modified phalanx at the center, flanked by heavy cavalry in the Macedonian tradition, with Chinese-influenced crossbow units providing ranged support, and allied steppe horsemen performing reconnaissance and harassment. The battle ended not in decisive victory but in strategic stalemate, which, against nomadic forces, counted as success. The Xiongnu, sustaining heavier casualties than expected and denied access to key grazing lands, were forced to withdraw. Meanwhile, the economic isolation imposed on Xiongnu allies began to fracture the confederation, with several major tribes defecting to the imperial side in exchange for trading privileges and protection. The final component of Alexander's strategy came to fruition in 248 BCE with the signing of the Two Empires Accord with the newly unified Qin state in China. This unprecedented diplomatic achievement established a joint approach to the nomadic threat, including coordinated military responses, shared intelligence, and complementary economic policies designed to reward allied tribes while isolating hostile ones. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the establishment of a line of fortified trading posts jointly administered by Hellenistic and Chinese officials, an early Silk Road that functioned as both commercial network and security system. This northern crisis, while successfully contained, highlighted a fundamental vulnerability in Alexander's imperial system. The vast extent of the empire's frontiers made conventional defense increasingly impractical, even with the human and material resources of 3 continents. The solution Alexander now pursued represented perhaps his most radical departure from traditional thinking about empire. Rather than conceptualizing his domains as a territory with fixed borders to be defended, Alexander began reimagining the empire as a network of interconnected urban centers and trade routes, with more fluid frontier zones managed through a combination of military outposts, allied buffer states, and economic integration. This network empire approach, formalized in the Ecbatana directives of 247 BCE, prioritized control of key nodes and connections rather than territory itself, a concept centuries ahead of its time. The implementation of this new imperial paradigm coincided with, and was partly driven by, accelerating technological and economic changes throughout the empire. The ongoing cultural and scientific exchanges with China, combined with the already rich synthesis of Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and Indian traditions, was producing innovations at an unprecedented rate. Perhaps most significant was the development of what modern historians might recognize as an early form of the compass. Combining Greek understanding of magnetism with Chinese metallurgical techniques. First employed for land navigation across the featureless steppe, this technology was quickly adapted for maritime use, revolutionizing long-distance sea travel. By 245 BCE, imperial vessels were regularly traveling directly across the Arabian Sea to India, rather than hugging coastlines, drastically reducing journey times and expanding trade volumes. Similar advances occurred in agricultural technology. The introduction of the Chinese iron plow, combined with Greek mechanical innovations, increased farming efficiency dramatically. New crop varieties, transplanted across ecological zones, rice from India cultivated in the Nile Delta, Mediterranean olives grown in selected mountain valleys as far east as Afghanistan, created agricultural abundance that supported growing urban populations. These technological advances fueled social and economic changes that brought new challenges. Traditional craft workers found their skills rendered obsolete by new production methods. Agricultural innovations displaced rural populations who migrated to cities seeking work. Merchants and traders emerged as an increasingly powerful social class, sometimes rivaling traditional landholding elites and military leaders. Alexander, long accustomed to thinking in grand strategic terms, recognized that these internal transformations represented as great a challenge to imperial stability as any external threat. His response was characteristically bold. The civic regeneration program launched in 244 BCE, which aimed to systematically reshape urban environments to accommodate social change while reinforcing imperial ideology. This massive public works initiative, implemented simultaneously in cities across the empire, included several components: expansion of urban housing to accommodate rural migrants, construction of new public facilities, baths, theaters, markets, to integrate diverse populations, establishment of imperial schools teaching a standardized curriculum that combined practical technical training with cultural content emphasizing imperial unity, and the creation of public welfare systems to support those displaced by economic changes. The architectural record from this period reveals a deliberate aesthetic strategy. Public buildings combined elements from multiple cultural traditions, Greek columns supporting Persian-style domes, Egyptian decorative motifs alongside Bactrian imagery, creating a distinctive imperial style that visually reinforced the concept of cultural synthesis. Massive statues of Alexander appeared in central squares, always depicted in the same distinctive manner, aged but powerful, wearing a composite costume incorporating elements from all major cultures of the empire, and with features that subtly combined ethnic characteristics. This physical transformation of urban space was complemented by refinements to imperial ideology. The imperial cult, which had evolved over decades from Alexander's original association with Zeus Ammon, now incorporated elements from nearly every religious tradition within the empire, positioning Alexander as the human embodiment of a universal divine principle that transcended particular cultural expressions. Philosophical developments supported this religious syncretism. At the Library of Alexandria and similar institutions throughout the empire, scholars worked to identify commonalities between Greek philosophical schools, particularly Stoicism, Persian Zoroastrianism, emerging Buddhist ideas from India, and Confucian and Taoist concepts imported from China. The resulting unitary philosophy, while intellectually problematic in many respects, provided a theoretical framework for imperial unity that appealed to educated elites across cultural boundaries. Even as these ideological efforts proceeded, however, new centers of power were emerging that would challenge imperial cohesion. By 240 BCE, several of the regional co-rulers established under the Pella Declaration had begun developing their own courts, administrative systems, and even distinct cultural policies. While still acknowledging Alexander's supreme authority, they increasingly acted as kings in all but name within their respective territories. The aging Alexander, now 96, responded to this development not by attempting to reassert centralized control, which would have risked open conflict, but by formalizing and regularizing these emerging power centers. The Susa Compact of 239 BCE explicitly recognized regional rulers as kings within a broader imperial confederation, with Alexander taking the unprecedented title of King of Kings and Emperor of the World, a formulation that drew explicitly on Persian precedents. This restructuring represented a pragmatic adaptation to reality rather than a retreat from Alexander's universalist vision. By accommodating regional autonomy within a flexible imperial framework, Alexander hoped to ensure the empire's survival in some form after his death, even if not as the centralized state he had once envisioned. The final years of Alexander's reign were marked by an increasing focus on his intellectual and cultural legacy. The physical vigor that had defined him throughout his life was finally waning, though contemporary accounts suggest he retained his mental acuity until near the end. Unable to personally lead armies or travel extensively, he devoted his energies to codifying the knowledge and wisdom accumulated during his reign. The most tangible manifestation of this effort was the expansion of the Library of Alexandria into what he termed the universal repository of knowledge. Beyond merely collecting texts, this institution was charged with actively synthesizing information from all traditions, creating comprehensive works on medicine that incorporated Greek, Egyptian, Indian, and Chinese approaches, mathematical treatises that unified different numerical systems and problem-solving methods, geographical works that compiled observations from explorers across 3 continents. Alexander personally dictated his memoirs during this period, producing what would have been an invaluable historical source had it survived intact. Fragments preserved in later works suggest it combined straightforward military narrative with philosophical reflections on power, cultural difference, and the nature of civilization, the collected wisdom of a man who had experienced more of the world than perhaps any other individual in pre-modern history. As mortality loomed ever closer, Alexander made his final arrangements for succession. Recognizing that no single heir could command the loyalty given to him, he formalized the system of regional kings under an imperial council that would make decisions on matters affecting the entire empire. This council, comprising both family members and trusted non-relatives representing different cultural traditions, was designed to balance competing interests while maintaining essential unity. In the winter of 224 BCE, as Alexander approached his 100th year, his health began to fail significantly. Summoning his strength for a final public appearance at the spring equinox festival in Babylon, he delivered what became known as the Address to the World, a speech subsequently inscribed on monuments throughout the empire. In this remarkable document, Alexander reflected on the transformation of the world during his lifetime, from the divided city-states and kingdoms of his youth to the interconnected civilization of his final years. He acknowledged both triumphs and failures, emphasizing that the true work of building a universal human community remained unfinished. Most strikingly, he explicitly rejected deification, stating that his achievements were those of a mortal man working with other mortals, and that true divinity lay in the creative potential of humanity as a whole. Alexander died peacefully in the summer of 223 BCE, having witnessed the centennial of his birth. His body, embalmed according to Egyptian techniques but dressed in the simple style of a Macedonian warrior, lay in state for 40 days as representatives from every part of the empire came to pay respects. The funeral procession that followed was the most elaborate ceremony the ancient world had ever witnessed, incorporating ritual elements from every major culture within the empire. The golden sarcophagus, carried on a monumental wagon drawn by 64 elephants, traveled for nearly a year through major cities before reaching its final destination, a purpose-built mausoleum at the original Alexandria in Egypt. This structure, combining architectural elements from Macedonian, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian traditions, became one of the wonders of the ancient world and a pilgrimage site for centuries thereafter. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of his final arrangements. The imperial council functioned effectively in managing the transition, preserving essential unity while accommodating regional diversity. No civil war erupted, as had occurred in our timeline following Alexander's premature death, yet centrifugal forces were already at work. Regional kings, while nominally acknowledging the council's authority, increasingly pursued independent policies. Trade continued to bind the empire economically, and cultural exchanges persisted, but political fragmentation accelerated in subsequent decades. By the end of the century, what had once been a unified empire had evolved into a commonwealth of kingdoms, still connected by shared cultural elements, diplomatic relations, and economic interdependence, but no longer under singular authority. The dream of universal empire had given way to a multipolar world system that nevertheless remained transformed by Alexander's legacy. This fragmentation, however, should not be viewed as the failure of Alexander's vision but as its evolution. The cultural synthesis he had promoted continued to develop independently of political structures. Greek philosophical concepts merged with Indian religious ideas to produce new spiritual movements. Chinese technologies combined with Mediterranean engineering traditions to enable further innovations. Art forms incorporating elements from multiple traditions spread across cultural boundaries. The world Alexander left behind in this alternative history differed profoundly from our own timeline. Where our ancient world remained divided between East and West, with limited interaction between major civilizations, this alternative world experienced centuries of intensive cross-cultural exchange. Scientific and technological development accelerated dramatically, with innovations that our world would not see until much later, including papermaking, rudimentary steam power, and advanced mathematical concepts, emerging by the 1st century BCE. Political structures similarly evolved differently. Where our historical trajectory led through the Roman Empire to the nation-state system, this alternative world developed flexible, multinational political entities that accommodated cultural diversity within common institutional frameworks. The concept of citizenship expanded beyond city or ethnic affiliation to encompass broader identities based on shared values and participation in common civic institutions. Perhaps most significantly, the philosophical and religious landscape was transformed. The rigid divisions between Western and Eastern thought that characterized our intellectual history never fully formed. Instead, synthetic philosophical systems emerged that combined Greek logical rigor with Chinese ethical pragmatism and Indian metaphysical insights. Religious developments similarly crossed traditional boundaries, with concepts like monotheism, karma, and natural law merging into novel spiritual frameworks. Would this alternative world have avoided the darker chapters of our own history, the religious persecutions, genocidal campaigns, and destructive wars that have repeatedly derailed human progress? It would be naive to assume so. Human nature, with its capacity for both creation and destruction, remained unchanged. Yet the institutional frameworks and intellectual traditions established during Alexander's extended reign might have channeled these energies differently, perhaps allowing for more rapid resolution of conflicts and more effective transmission of knowledge across divisions. What can we, inhabitants of the actual timeline where Alexander died at 32, learn from this counterfactual exploration? Perhaps most importantly, it highlights the contingent nature of historical development, how profoundly the course of human civilization can be altered by seemingly small events, like one man's recovery from or succumbing to illness. It reminds us that the divisions we often take for granted, between East and West, between scientific and spiritual worldviews, between competing political systems, are not inevitable but historical products that might have developed very differently. Alexander's alternative century offers a glimpse of integration and synthesis that might inform our own approaches to global challenges. While we cannot rewrite our past, we can perhaps draw inspiration from this imagined history as we shape our future, seeking points of convergence across cultural traditions, building institutions that accommodate diversity within unity, and pursuing knowledge that transcends artificial boundaries between disciplines and traditions. In both our actual history and this counterfactual narrative, Alexander the Great stands as a pivotal figure who altered the course of human development. In our timeline, his conquests initiated the Hellenistic Age, spreading Greek culture and creating conditions for unprecedented exchange between civilizations. In this alternative world, his extended life allowed him to develop this process further. Establishing foundations for a more integrated global civilization, the question that remains, as relevant to our world as to this imagined alternative, is whether humanity can achieve meaningful unity without conquest, whether the positive aspects of cultural exchange and integration that Alexander's empire facilitated might be realized without the violence and disruption that accompanied his achievements. That challenge, perhaps, represents Alexander's true legacy to future generations in any timeline.